Have you ever wondered what it's like when a lifetime of detective work follows you into retirement? My name is Frank Morrison, and after 42 years of investigating everything from petty theft to murder cases, I thought I'd seen it all. I was wrong. What happened to me last month proves that some mysteries find you when you least expect them, and sometimes the most ordinary situations hide the most extraordinary secrets. Picture this. You're 68 years old, enjoying your morning coffee on the porch, watching the neighborhood kids walk to school, thinking your days of chasing down clues are behind you. Then a simple trip to the grocery store turns into the most puzzling case you've ever encountered. And here's the kicker. It wasn't even a crime. At least, not in the way you'd expect. Let me take you back to March 15th, a Tuesday morning that started like any other. My wife, Margaret, had left me a grocery list longer than my arm, and I was grumbling about having to buy organic this and gluten-free that. After 4 decades of surviving on gas station coffee and vending machine sandwiches during stakeouts, I still couldn't understand why we needed 17 different types of milk. But happy wife, happy life, right? The supermarket was nearly empty at 9 a.m., which is exactly how I liked it. No crowds, no screaming kids, just me and my methodical approach to shopping. I'd developed a system over the years, produce first, dairy last, frozen foods grabbed at the very end. Old habits from a lifetime of organization and attention to detail. I was in the cereal aisle, trying to decipher the difference between 12-grain and ancient grain bread, when I noticed him. Now, when you've spent as many years as I have reading people, certain things jump out at you. Body language, nervous habits, inconsistencies in behavior. They all tell a story. And this guy was practically screaming a novel. He was about 35, average height, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Nothing unusual there. But here's what caught my attention. He was shopping with purpose, but not the right kind of purpose. He moved through the aisles like he knew exactly where everything was, grabbed items without looking at prices or comparing brands, and here's the kicker, he never once looked at his phone or checked a shopping list. In today's world, that's almost impossible. But what really set off my internal alarm bells was his pattern of movement. He'd grab something, move 3 aisles over, grab something else, then circle back. It wasn't random wandering There was a method to it, a very specific method that reminded me of surveillance techniques I'd learned decades ago. This man was making sure he wasn't being followed. Now I should mention that Margaret has been after me for years to mind my own business. Frank, she'd say, you're retired. Stop looking for mysteries in every shadow. But 42 years of instincts don't just disappear because you get a pension. And this situation was pinging every radar I had. I decided to do a little casual observation. Nothing intrusive, just keeping an eye on things while I finished my shopping. That's when things got really interesting. Our mysterious shopper wasn't just avoiding followers, He was communicating with someone, but not in any way you'd expect. Every time he reached for an item on a high shelf, he'd position himself so he could see down a specific aisle. When he bent down to grab something from a lower shelf, he'd glance toward the pharmacy section. And when he stood in the checkout line, he'd adjust his baseball cap twice, then once more. It was a signaling system, clear as day to someone who'd spent years watching for exactly these kinds of patterns. At this point, I was fully invested. My shopping cart was full, but my curiosity was overflowing. I positioned myself at the customer service counter, pretending to ask about their senior discount program while keeping our subject in peripheral vision. That's when I spotted his contact. She was a woman in her 50s, dressed like any other suburban mom doing her morning shopping. But she was mirroring his movements, staying exactly 3 aisles away, and responding to his signals with subtle gestures of her own. When he adjusted his cap twice, she'd touch her earring. When he bent down to look at something, she'd check her watch. They were coordinating something, but what? The detective in me was screaming that this was some kind of criminal activity. Drug dealing, maybe, or industrial espionage. My imagination was running wild with possibilities, but the rational part of my brain, the part that had learned to wait for evidence before jumping to conclusions, told me to be patient and observe more. Their elaborate dance continued for another 20 minutes. They never spoke, never made eye contact, never even came close to each other, but they were clearly working together on something. Finally, the man finished his shopping and headed to the checkout line. The woman followed suit, choosing a register 3 lanes over. Here's where my years of experience really paid off. I knew that whatever was happening, the key moment would come when they left the store. So I quickly paid for my groceries and positioned myself outside, pretending to load my car while watching the parking lot. The man exited first, walked to a blue sedan, and began loading his groceries. Normal behavior. The woman came out 2 minutes later, walked to a red SUV parked 4 spaces away, and did the same. Still normal. But then, just as I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing, something extraordinary happened. The woman dropped her keys. Not accidentally, deliberately. They fell in a specific spot between the 2 vehicles. The man saw this, finished loading his groceries, and then walked over to help her. Except he didn't just hand her the keys. He picked them up, but before giving them back, he pressed something into her palm. Something small, something that had been hidden in his grocery bag. Now I was really intrigued. What could be so important that it required this elaborate charade? Drugs seemed unlikely or too risky for such a public place. Money? Possibly. But why not just use an ATM or bank transfer? Information? That seemed more likely. But what kind of information required this level of secrecy? I made a decision that Margaret would definitely not approve of. I was going to follow them. Not both of them. That would be impossible. But I could tail one of them and see where this led. I chose the woman, partly because her red SUV would be easier to follow, and partly because something about her seemed more approachable if I needed to make contact. Following someone without being detected is an art form. You need to stay far enough back to avoid suspicion, but close enough to not lose them. You need to vary your distance and lane position, and you need to be prepared for sudden stops, turns, or evasive maneuvers. It's like riding a bicycle. Once you learn, you never forget. The woman drove carefully, obeying all traffic laws, using her turn signals, stopping completely at stop signs, model citizen behavior. But she was also checking her mirrors more frequently than normal, and she made 2 unnecessary turns that brought her back to the main road. She was making sure she wasn't being followed. Professional behavior. After about 15 minutes of driving, she pulled into the parking lot of a small office building downtown. I parked across the street and watched as she got out of her SUV, walked to the building entrance, and used a key card to enter. This wasn't a random stop. Wow. She worked here, or at least had legitimate access. The building was 3 stories tall, with a simple sign that read, Hartley & Associates Certified Public Accountants. Not exactly what I was expecting for a covert operation headquarters. But then again, the best hiding spots are often in plain sight. I waited, and waited, and waited some more. After 30 minutes, I was starting to feel foolish. Maybe I'd let my imagination run wild. Maybe these were just 2 people who knew each other and had exchanged something perfectly innocent. Maybe retirement was making me paranoid. But then the woman emerged from the building and everything changed. She wasn't alone. With her was a man in his 60s, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a briefcase. They spoke briefly at the entrance, and then he handed her an envelope, a thick envelope. She put it in her purse, they shook hands, and he walked to a black luxury sedan parked at the curb. Now I had 3 people involved in whatever this was. The grocery store operatives and this businessman. The plot was thickening, and my detective instincts were in full gear. But I was also starting to realize that I was in over my head. If this was some kind of criminal enterprise, I was conducting an unauthorized investigation without backup or resources. If it was innocent, I was stalking people and invading their privacy. The smart thing would have been to go home, tell Margaret about my morning adventure, and let it go. But 42 years of investigative work had taught me that the smart thing and the right thing aren't always the same, and something about this whole situation felt wrong. Not dangerous wrong, but puzzle piece missing wrong. I decided to do one more thing before giving up. I walked across the street to the office building and checked the directory in the lobby. Hartley & Associates occupied the second floor, along with a law firm and a small nonprofit organization. The third floor housed a private investigation agency called Blackwood Security Services. Interesting. The first floor was mostly retail, a coffee shop, a dry cleaner, and a small bookstore. I decided to grab a cup of coffee and see if I could learn anything from casual conversation. The barista was a college kid with purple hair and multiple piercings who seemed happy to chat with a friendly grandfather figure. "Been working here long?" I asked, making small talk while she prepared my coffee. "About 6 months," she replied. "It's pretty quiet most of the time, mostly office workers and a few regulars. I noticed that accounting firm upstairs. Seem like busy folks?" She laughed. "Oh, you mean the Hartley people? Yeah, they're always coming and going, but they're not really accountants." My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. "They're not?" "Well, I mean, they might do some accounting, but mostly they help people with family stuff. You know, like when people are trying to find relatives they've lost touch with, or when someone dies and the family needs help tracking down assets and beneficiaries. My friend's mom used them when her dad passed away and they couldn't find all his bank accounts." Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The elaborate precautions, the secret exchange, the careful coordination, it all made sense now. But not in the way I'd expected. These people weren't criminals. They were helping with something that required discretion for legitimate reasons. The grocery store exchange was about privacy, not crime. The woman worked for a firm that specialized in family asset recovery and genealogical services. The businessman was likely a client or a contact with information about a case. But why all the secrecy? Why not just meet in an office like normal business people? The answer came to me as I thought about some of the estate cases I'd worked on as a detective. Sometimes families don't want it known that they're looking for money or assets. Sometimes there are legal reasons for discretion. And sometimes, when you're dealing with people who've been estranged for years, the wrong word in the wrong ear can destroy delicate negotiations. I finished my coffee and walked back to my car, feeling both satisfied and slightly embarrassed. I'd solved the mystery, but the mystery wasn't what I thought it was. These people were conducting legitimate business that required privacy and discretion. They'd developed an elaborate system to avoid unwanted attention, not because they were doing anything wrong, but because their clients needed confidentiality. The drive home gave me time to reflect on what had happened. I'd let my detective instincts override my common sense, and I'd spent an entire morning investigating people who were just doing their jobs. But I'd also demonstrated that retirement hadn't dulled my observational skills or my ability to read people and situations. When I got home, Margaret was waiting on the porch with a knowing smile. "How was your trip to the grocery store, Detective Morrison?" "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to look innocent. "Frank, you've been gone for 4 hours. Either you got lost in the cereal aisle, or you found something that piqued your curiosity. And given that you came home with exactly the items on my list and nothing else, I'm guessing it wasn't the groceries that kept you busy." I sat down next to her and told her the whole story. She listened patiently, occasionally shaking her head or rolling her eyes, but never interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "So, let me get this straight," she finally said. "You spent your morning following innocent people around town because they were being discreet about their business? When you put it like that, it sounds bad. It sounds like you need a hobby." She was right, of course. But as I sat there on the porch, watching the neighborhood kids come home from school, I realized something important. My detective instincts weren't a liability in retirement. They were a gift. I'd observed something unusual, investigated it safely and discreetly, and solved a puzzle that had been bothering me. The fact that the answer was benign didn't make the exercise less valuable. That evening, I called my former partner, Detective Sarah Chen, and told her about my adventure. She laughed until she cried. "Frank," she said, "you just conducted a perfect surveillance operation on a perfectly legal business meeting. You've still got it, but maybe next time, try using those skills for something useful." "Like what?" "Well, Mrs. Peterson down the street has been complaining about someone stealing her newspaper, and the Johnson family can't figure out who's been leaving flowers on their mother's grave every week. Real mysteries, Frank. ones that actually need solving. She had a point. There are mysteries everywhere, and not all of them require a badge or a gun to solve. Sometimes the most interesting puzzles are the ones right in front of us, hiding in plain sight in our own neighborhoods. The next morning, I started my day with a purpose. I made my coffee, sat on the porch, and began to really observe my surroundings. Not with suspicion, but with curiosity. Who were all these people I'd been living near for years? What were their stories? What small mysteries might be hiding in the everyday routines of suburban life? And you know what? I found plenty to keep me busy. The retired teacher who received mysterious packages every Tuesday. The young couple who left their house every Thursday at exactly 3 a.m. The teenager who spent hours every evening in the park, apparently talking to himself. Each observation was a potential story, a potential mystery, a potential adventure. And the best part was that I could investigate these puzzles without violating anyone's privacy or overstepping boundaries. I could simply be a curious neighbor, interested in the people and community around me. My grocery store adventure taught me that retirement doesn't mean the end of discovery. It just means discovering different things in different ways. The skills I'd developed over 4 decades of detective work weren't obsolete. They just needed to be applied to new challenges. And who knows? Maybe someday I'll stumble across something that actually requires police attention. But until then, I'm content to be the neighborhood's unofficial observer, the guy who notices the small details that others miss, the retired detective who's learned that the most interesting mysteries aren't always the ones that make headlines. Sometimes they're just hidden in the everyday moments of ordinary life, waiting for someone with the right eyes to see them.